The Oregon Trail, more than just a line on a map, it was a lifeline for tens of thousands of pioneers seeking a new beginning in the untamed West. But what was it really like to traverse nearly 2,000 miles of rugged wilderness, braving extreme weather, scarce resources, and constant danger? The romanticized images of wagons rolling west often overshadow the grueling realities faced by these determined travelers. Join us as we unravel the truth behind one of the most iconic migrations in American history, shedding light on the hardships, resilience, and triumphs of life on the trail. And if you enjoy diving into the fascinating stories of the Old West, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more captivating content. In the spring of 1843, a small wave of hopeful settlers began what would soon grow into a massive migration. They packed their belongings into canvas-covered wagons, handcarts, and any other means of transportation capable of carrying them westward. Their journey followed a route that was not a single, defined path, but rather a network of trails that sometimes merged and at other times diverged into various branches. This trail wound along rivers, stretched across expanses of tall grass and short grass prairies, threaded through rugged mountain passes, and eventually crossed the Pacific slope to reach the fertile lands of Oregon and California. Tragically, about 1 in every 17 pioneers would not survive the journey, a sobering statistic that highlighted the challenges of this ambitious endeavor. Today, traces of their passage endure in the form of wagon ruts still visible in the fragile soil of the Western Plains, a testament to their determination and resilience. The route, later known as the Oregon Trail, emerged during a transformative period in American history. At the time, the westward expansion of the United States had largely stalled at the Missouri River. To the west of this boundary, Mexico controlled California, Alaska remained under Russian ownership, and the vast region between the Rocky Mountains and the Pacific Ocean was a British-held territory called Oregon. The trail became a critical corridor for American settlers seeking to fulfill the country's growing vision of manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was destined to expand from coast to coast. Independence, Missouri, became the focal point for this westward migration. In 1843, a growing number of immigrants converged on the town, traveling by steamboat and over crude roads often turned to mud pits by seasonal rains. These travelers were predominantly farming families, husbands, wives, and children, motivated by the dream of a better life. They envisioned Oregon as a land of untapped potential, rich with fertile soil and abundant resources, though they knew little about the challenges of reaching or living in such a distant and unknown place. Many of these families hailed from states like Iowa, Missouri, and Arkansas, where they had faced economic struggles and health challenges. The economic downturn following the Panic of 1837 had devastated agricultural markets, driving down land values and crop prices, while the bottomlands, once viewed as promising farmland, had become hotspots for malaria and other illnesses. These hardships fueled a collective sense of disillusionment and a desire to leave behind their struggles in pursuit of a more promising future. The Oregon Trail was not just a path through the wilderness, it was a symbol of hope, resilience, and the American spirit of exploration. Each mile traveled represented a step toward a new beginning, even as it tested the strength and endurance of those who dared to undertake it. There were many grand stories about the lands to the west, particularly California and Oregon. It was believed that California's golden valleys were free from snow, Oregon's dark soil was so rich it seemed bottomless, and that the great rivers of the region provided convenient transportation. Additionally, some said there were no forests to block the path of wagons heading westward. These tales, while exaggerated or outright untrue, inspired many settlers to embark on the journey. In fact, their lack of complete knowledge may have been a hidden blessing, sparing them from fears that could have kept them rooted in their current circumstances. Despite the uncertainty, these settlers were no strangers to hard work or the challenges of pioneering. Many were seasoned farm folk who had previously carved homes out of wilderness. They were skilled with essential tools like rifles and axes and adept at managing wagons and livestock. Women, too, were equal partners in the journey, accustomed to walking alongside the men and sharing the burdens of survival. Most of all, these people were restless by nature. Once a farm was established and its fields tamed, The limited opportunities in small backwoods communities often stifled their ambitions. For them, the boundless possibilities of the West called with an irresistible allure. It was almost as though the land itself beckoned them forward. Novelist Willa Cather captured this sentiment when she wrote in My Antonia, "As I looked about me, I felt that the grass was the country, as the water is the sea. And there was so much motion in it. The whole country seemed, somehow, to be running." Stories of prior successes added to the momentum. Pioneers heard of Joe Meek and Bob Newell, two mountain men who managed to take wagons through the challenging Blue Mountains in 1840, using small ponies to pull their makeshift vehicles. Their journey ended at Fort Walla Walla, after which they continued by boat to the fertile Willamette Valley. This accomplishment demonstrated that wagon travel westward was possible, even through difficult terrain. The following year, in 1841, John Bidwell and John Bartleson organized the first planned overland expedition westward to California. Their journey became the foundation for what would later be named the Oregon Trail. At Soda Springs in what is now southwest Idaho, a portion of the group broke off and headed toward Oregon. Bidwell documented their route, describing landmarks that would become iconic to Oregon Trail travelers, such as Courthouse Rock, Chimney Rock, Scotts Bluff, Fort Laramie, and Independence Rock. In 1842, Dr. Elijah White, appointed as an Indian agent for Oregon, successfully led a group of 125 men, women, and children to the region. However, the most significant migration came in 1843 with what historians refer to as the Great Emigration. On May 13th of that year, over 900 settlers gathered at Fitzhugh's Mill, near Independence, Missouri, preparing for the arduous trek. They formed into companies, elected leaders, and hired experienced frontiersmen as guides. Peter Burnett became the captain of the main group, while Jesse Applegate led a slower-moving cow column for wagons carrying livestock. Applegate later chronicled the experience in his memoir, A Day with the Cow Column, in 1843. The settlers followed trails blazed by earlier pioneers, including Joe Meek and Bob Newell, and relied on the expertise of men like John Gant, who acted as their chief guide up to Fort Hall. Together they pushed westward, forming the foundation of what would become one of the most transformative migrations in American history. The Oregon Trail, with its milestones and stories of perseverance, symbolized the promise of a new beginning in a land of opportunity. Marcus Whitman, a Protestant missionary and physician, had first established his mission in Oregon in 1836. In 1843, he returned westward after a trip back east and joined the Applegate train. Physicians like Whitman were a rare and invaluable presence on the trail, and his contributions left a lasting impression. Jesse Applegate, a key leader of the Emigrant Party, referred to Whitman as that good angel of the emigrants. Applegate went so far as to say that the success of the 1843 journey owed more to Dr. Whitman than to any other individual. Whitman's knowledge and skills as a doctor undoubtedly alleviated many hardships for those on the trail, where illness and injury were common challenges. Among the travelers in the Applegate party was Jesse Applegate's 7-year-old nephew, also named Jesse Applegate, though often referred to as Jesse A., or simply Jess to avoid confusion. Jess traveled with his parents, siblings, and other relatives in one of the many extended family groups making the westward journey. Decades later, in his 70s, Jess would write Recollections of My Boyhood, offering a rare glimpse of the 1843 crossing through the perspective of a young child. Initially, Jess's memories of the journey brimmed with excitement and adventure. To a boy his age, the trip must have felt like an extraordinary adventure. He found the Plains Indians fascinating, describing their appearance as both striking and dignified. He remembered trading nails and bits of metal with indigenous children and engaging in playful antics, like tossing buffalo chips with other settler children. Through his youthful eyes, the Oregon Trail was a grand escapade full of wonder and novelty. As the journey progressed, however, Jess's recollections became more subdued. The realities of life on the trail began to take a toll. Supplies of food dwindled, and finding drinkable water became increasingly difficult. Exhaustion, both physical and emotional, set in as the group pressed onward. This weariness was a near universal experience for emigrants on the trail, as the journey was grueling even under the best circumstances. The promise of Oregon, however, had been enough to inspire countless families like the Applegates to undertake such a challenge. Enthusiasm for the region had been stoked by widespread propaganda, including pamphlets, newspapers, and emigrants' guidebooks. These sources painted Oregon as a land of endless opportunity, where fertile soil, abundant resources, and the chance for a better life awaited. Many settlers were further enticed by the U.S. government's offer of generous land claims, up to 640 acres for nearly nothing. Yet the physical journey often overshadowed the vision that had inspired it. As travelers moved westward, many lost sight of the hopeful image of Oregon they had clung to at the start. Hiram Crittenden, an observer of the time, described the Oregon Trail as littered with evidence of hardship, abandoned belongings, skeletal remains of livestock, and fresh burial mounds. These markers told a somber story of the immense challenges that emigrants faced, even as they pursued their dreams of a new beginning. Through it all, the Oregon Trail remained a symbol of resilience and determination, where families like the Applegates persevered despite the odds. For young Jess, the trail may have started as a grand adventure, but it became a powerful lesson in both the sacrifices and the rewards of pursuing a dream. The hardships of the Oregon Trail often stacked one upon another, testing the endurance of even the most resolute travelers. At times, the sheer weight of the challenges brought both men and women to tears, and for some, the obstacles became overwhelming enough to consider turning back. Yet most pioneers managed to tap into extraordinary reserves of courage and persistence, pressing onward despite the adversities they encountered. Their determination became their greatest ally, enabling them to face an array of difficulties, from unexpected injuries, such as a mule kick, to the ominous threat of diseases like cholera. Timing was critical for the success of these journeys. The Applegate train began organizing in late April, a carefully chosen period to ensure the best chance of success. Departing too early in the season meant the grasslands would not have grown enough to provide sufficient grazing for livestock, leading to weakened animals and slower travel. On the other hand, setting out too late risked running into early snowstorms in the mountains, potentially trapping the wagons in perilous conditions. Such timing miscalculations could derail even the best-prepared expeditions. Independence, Missouri, served as the departure point for the Applegate train. Established in 1827, it had become a leading hub for outfitting westward travelers. Other groups chose locations like Westport, Leavenworth, and St. Joseph. But Independence remained a favorite, thanks to its strategic location and the availability of supplies. Most emigrants were farming families who needed durable and practical wagons to carry their belongings. The lightweight Murphy farm wagon was the most popular choice, as the larger Conestoga wagons, which weighed over 1.5 tons when empty, were impractical for the rugged terrain and lacked maneuverability. Emigrants were advised to keep their fully loaded wagons under 1.5 tons to avoid the risk of getting bogged down in mud or overtaxing their draft animals. A new wagon and the necessary spare parts, essential for handling inevitable breakdowns, cost families around $100, a significant expense at the time. These wagons, often called prairie schooners, were designed with practicality in mind. They had bodies about 10 feet long and 3.5 feet wide, covered by durable canvas or waterproof fabric known as Osnaburg. Hickory bows supported the covers, which provided much-needed shelter from rain and the harsh sun. The construction of the wagons reflected their purpose. The rear wheels, standing 5 to 6 feet tall, were larger than the front wheels, which were typically 4 feet or less. This design minimized the risk of the wheels jamming against the wagon body during sharp turns. Metal components were kept to a minimum to reduce weight, but iron rims reinforced the wheels, protecting them from wear. Despite these precautions, wagon wheels were prone to cracking and shrinking in the dry Great Plains air, which sometimes caused the iron rims to slip off. In such cases, travelers had to stop to make repairs, highlighting the importance of carrying spare parts and tools. When rivers proved too deep to ford and no timber was available for building rafts, these wagons displayed their versatility. Pioneers removed the wheels and used the wagon bodies as makeshift rafts to float across the water. This adaptability was essential for crossing the many natural obstacles along the route. Selecting draft animals was another critical decision. Most pioneers, including Captain Peter Burnett, favored oxen for their strength, patience, and durability. Burnett once described oxen as the most noble animal, patient, thrifty, durable, and gentle. However, oxen were not without their challenges. Their cloven hooves were vulnerable to splitting on rocky terrain, and their pace was slower than that of mules, covering an average of 15 miles per day compared to the mule's 20. Frustrated emigrants often remarked that oxen didn't walk, they plodded. Despite these limitations, oxen were chosen more frequently because of their reliability and cost-effectiveness. Together with their wagons, these animals were a lifeline for families seeking new opportunities in the uncharted lands of the West. Wealthier families often opted to take two or more wagons on their journey, as a single wagon offered only limited space for the essential supplies needed to survive the arduous trek. After packing the basics, such as sacks of flour, preserved foods, clothing, and farming tools, there was little room left for anything else. Space constraints forced travelers to live much of their lives outside the wagons. Except during severe weather, cooking, eating, and sleeping were all done in the open air, a practice that became second nature to those heading west. J. McCall, a chronicler of westward migration, noted the curious habits of his fellow pioneers when it came to packing. He described how many travelers brought excessive quantities of basic provisions like bacon, flour, and beans, but also an astonishing variety of unnecessary or impractical items. His list included pins and needles, brooms and brushes, ox shoes and horseshoes, lasts and leather, glass beads and hawk bells, jumping jacks and Jews harps, rings and bracelets, pocket mirrors and pocketbooks, calico vests and boiled shirts. These items, while sentimental or entertaining, rarely served a practical purpose and often became burdensome. McCall likened the chaotic loading of wagons to birds constructing a nest, an apt metaphor for the seemingly haphazard way families prepared for their journey. While the wagons were crucial for transporting supplies, meat was often secured from the herd of cattle that followed behind. Although the Applegate train occasionally hunted buffalo and antelope, maintaining a traveling herd provided a more reliable source of protein. Once the wagons were packed, the livestock rounded up, and the travelers organized into manageable groups, Captain Peter Burnett gave the long-awaited signal to begin the journey. The Applegate train, part of the larger Great Emigration of 1843, consisted of nearly 1,000 men, women, and children. They traveled with over 200 wagons, 700 oxen, and around 800 head of cattle, making the expedition one of the most ambitious of its time. Jesse Applegate, who led the train's cattle column, later reflected on the migration, calling it an experiment in 1843. It was a bold and unprecedented undertaking to move such a large group across the continent to Oregon. In May, as the travelers progressed across the plains, the landscape was marked by lush grass and vibrant wildflowers, creating a striking contrast to the challenges ahead. The spring weather, while often pleasant, could also be unpredictable. Travelers reported intense thunderstorms that shook the heavens with thunder and lightning. One diarist described a gale that left the ground covered in water, drenched travelers despite the protection of wagon covers, and scattered livestock far and wide, creating disarray. The initial stretch of the journey was filled with excitement, but it was not without challenges. Untrained oxen and mules often resisted their harnesses, leading to delays and confusion. Some animals broke free and bolted back toward the starting point, forcing pioneers to spend time rounding them up. Among the travelers, disputes occasionally arose over access to firewood, water, or the best positions in the wagon train. However, these early trials were minor compared to the grueling conditions the emigrants would face later. During the first weeks on the trail, the challenges were manageable. The relatively pleasant weather provided an opportunity for pioneers to acclimate to life on the move. As they traveled northwest toward Nebraska and followed the Platte River, they had time to refine their skills in handling the wagons, called prairie schooners for their resemblance to ships sailing through an ocean of grass. This period of adjustment was crucial in preparing the emigrants for the harsher realities that lay ahead. The prairie schooners, as the covered wagons were called, crossed the Big Blue River, a tributary of the Kansas River, about 2 weeks after departing Independence, Missouri. From there, the trail turned northward into Nebraska, where it followed the south bank of the Platte River. The Platte, with its wide and shallow expanse, often drew comments from travelers. Martha Missouri Moore remarked that the river ran near the top of the ground, a vivid description of its seemingly surface-level flow. A common saying among pioneers was that the Platte River was a mile wide and an inch deep, capturing its unusual flatness and silty waters. As the emigrants progressed onto the Great Plains, they were awestruck by the vastness of the landscape. Sarah Cummins compared the plains to the wild regions of Africa, marveling at the unspoiled terrain that stretched endlessly before them. Wildlife added to this sense of wonder. The emigrants frequently encountered animals such as antelope, prairie dogs, coyotes, and both black and grizzly bears. Buffalo were especially abundant. One traveler noted how herds of buffalo could be seen grazing peacefully or moving in large, thundering groups that made a roaring sound as they trampled the ground. Occasionally, cows from the emigrants' herds would wander off and join the buffalo, causing frustration for their owners. While buffaloes sometimes polluted streams or disrupted travel, they were largely regarded as an invaluable resource. Their meat provided nourishment, and their dried dung, known as buffalo chips, served as an essential source of fuel on the treeless plains. Interactions with Native Americans were relatively peaceful during the early years of westward migration, particularly in the 1840s. Many indigenous groups were helpful, offering guidance about the trail ahead or serving as paid guides. The sight of Native American riders on pinto ponies, some pulling travois laden with supplies, was a common one. These travelers often stopped to trade buffalo robes, moccasins, and fringe clothing for tobacco, iron goods, or worn clothing. To ensure safety, emigrants took precautions, forming wagon circles at each stop to protect their livestock and create a sense of security. Though the circle provided protection, full-scale attacks by Native Americans were exceedingly rare during this period, as such confrontations could result in significant losses for the attackers. However, smaller groups of immigrants were occasionally targeted for horses or supplies. Despite these occasional tensions, major conflicts with Native Americans were rare prior to the California Gold Rush of 1849. It is estimated that fewer than 60 deaths, divided almost evenly between immigrants and Native Americans, occurred along the Oregon Trail in the 1840s due to violence. By the 1850s and 1860s, relations had deteriorated and attacks became more common, especially during periods of increased migration. In some instances, such as the Bannock attack on the Utter Wagon Train in 1860, entire groups faced extreme hardship, with only a fraction of travelers surviving. By 1867, rising hostilities led the U.S. Army to prohibit single wagons from traveling through parts of western Kansas. Yet even at the height of these tensions, accidents and illnesses posed far greater risks to pioneers than interactions with Native Americans. The harsh realities of trail life included poor sanitation, a lack of medical knowledge, and the absence of vaccines. Emigrants often endured illness in stifling conditions inside the wagons, where the heat could be oppressive. Many relied on large doses of medicines like laudanum, believing that stronger doses would lead to faster recoveries. Unfortunately, this practice often caused severe side effects or even death. Among the diseases that plagued the emigrants, cholera was the most feared. Graves marked with the simple epitaph, "Died of cholera," were tragically common along the trail. The burial process itself reflected the harsh conditions. Without wood for coffins, bodies were wrapped in cloth and covered with earth and stones to protect them from scavengers. One particularly tragic incident in the Applegate train involved 6-year-old Joel Hembry. According to William Newby's account, the young boy fell from the tongue of the wagon, leading to a fatal accident. Such losses were deeply mourned and served as sobering reminders of the many dangers faced by families seeking a new life in the West. After a month of travel, the emigrants reached the point where the north and south forks of the Platte River converge, marking a significant milestone. By this time, they were 460 miles west of the Missouri River. Marcus Whitman, along with his nephew Perrin Whitman, served as invaluable guides, offering both leadership and practical advice as the wagon train faced increasingly challenging terrain. Dr. Whitman's key piece of guidance was simple but critical. Keep traveling. Even if it is only a few miles a day, keep moving. His medical expertise was equally essential as he treated the sick and injured without hesitation. Despite his best efforts, not all lives could be saved. Yet new life brought renewed hope. Babies were born along the journey, reminding everyone of the promise of a fresh start in Oregon. At this stage, the trail generally followed the North Fork of the Platte River. But before doing so, the emigrants faced the daunting task of crossing the South Fork. This crossing was no small feat. The river stretched over half a mile wide, and its waters were high. To waterproof their wagons, pioneers removed the wheels and covered the wagon beds with buffalo hides. The nickname prairie schooners was fitting, as the wagons resembled small boats navigating an inland sea. William Newby's diary entry revealed their resourcefulness. Hunted buffalo and killed two. We wanted their hides for to make bots to cross the river. Once the crossing was complete, the travelers left behind the flat Platte River Valley, traversed a 22-mile stretch of tableland, and descended into Ash Hollow. This small wooded valley offered a brief respite with its fresh spring water and shade, a welcome relief after the arduous journey so far. As the wagon train moved onward along the sandy banks of the North Platte, the emigrants were greeted by the snow-covered peaks of the distant Laramie Mountains. Closer to the trail, striking geological formations began to dominate the landscape. The first of these, Courthouse Rock and Jailhouse Rock, rose 400 feet above the surrounding plains. These formations, made of volcanic ash and clay, earned their names due to their resemblance to municipal buildings in St. Louis. Just 14 miles west, the travelers encountered the awe-inspiring Chimney Rock, a towering spire of stone that stood 500 feet tall. Surrounded by debris at its base, this natural wonder captured the imagination of nearly every traveler. It was likened to a chimney, a church steeple, a minaret, or even an inverted tunnel. The emigrants marveled at its size and visibility, noting that it remained in view for several days. One particularly curious individual counted 10,040 steps as he walked around its base. Further along the trail, about 20 miles beyond Chimney Rock, lay Scott's Bluff, a series of weathered towers and ridges that one observer described as a Nebraska Gibraltar. If the wagon train stayed on schedule, they would reach Scott's Bluff by late June. From there, it was just 2 more days to Fort Laramie, a key outpost in what is now southeastern Wyoming. Fort Laramie was a vital stop for rest and resupply. Women took the opportunity to wash clothing, while men attended to wagon repairs, such as refitting the iron tires on wheels that had contracted in the dry air. Even the animals required care. Oxen with sore hooves were placed into trenches to be shod. Although Fort Laramie marked a major accomplishment, it was also a sobering reminder of the journey ahead. At this point, the emigrants had covered 640 miles from independence, but they were only a third of the way to Oregon. Supplies were running low, with more than one-third likely consumed by this stage. Oxen and mules were exhausted, and the patience of their owners often wore thin. The road beyond Fort Laramie would bring even greater challenges as the climb into the Rocky Mountains loomed. To ease the burden on their animals, pioneers frequently lightened their loads, leaving behind countless belongings. The trail near Fort Laramie became strewn with discarded items: sheet iron stoves, tools, trunks, furniture, cookware, and even food. Treasured possessions that once seemed indispensable were now abandoned in the name of survival, a poignant reflection of the harsh realities of the journey westward. 55 miles beyond Soda Springs, travelers arrived at Fort Hall, a significant supply station operated by the Hudson's Bay Company. This marked a critical point in the journey, as wagon trains split into 2 groups, one heading southwest on the California Trail and the other continuing northwest toward Oregon. Those bound for California embarked on a grueling journey through an arid, rocky landscape. Over 525 miles and a month of travel, they eventually reached the imposing Sierra Nevada. However, before that, they had to navigate the challenging Great Basin near the Great Salt Lake. In this harsh and dusty environment, water was scarce, and many emigrants endured parched days under the relentless sun. One woman's poignant remark summarized the ordeal: "We swallowed dust all day in place of water." The agents at Fort Hall, British subjects employed by the Hudson's Bay Company, encouraged settlers to take the California route instead of heading to Oregon. Their motivations were not entirely altruistic. By steering emigrants away from Oregon, they sought to delay the influx of settlers and thereby protect the company's lucrative fur trade in the region. Even so, their cautionary tales about the Oregon Trail were not without merit. The route was fraught with challenges, including difficult river crossings, rugged terrain, and the threat of early winter storms. For the emigrants who chose to continue to Oregon, the trail followed the south rim of the Black Lava Canyons carved by the Snake River. The path was littered with boulders and twisted sagebrush, making progress slow and strenuous. Two significant crossings of the Snake River lay ahead, both of which posed considerable risks. The more treacherous of the two, the Three-Island Ford near present-day Glens Ferry, Idaho, tested the pioneers' ingenuity and teamwork. William Newby recorded the methodical process in his diary. First, we drove over a part of the river 100 yards wide onto an island, then over a northern branch 75 yards wide onto a second island. Then we tied a string of wagons together by a chain in the ring of the lead carriage's yoke and made fast to the wagon of all a horse ahead. The crossing was a collaborative effort, involving as many as 15 wagons at a time. The water, at its deepest, reached 10 inches up the wagon beds. Spanning 900 yards across, the ford was both a physical and psychological hurdle for the emigrants. Beyond the Snake River, the trail led through Burnt Canyon into present-day Oregon. The emigrants navigated the marshy terrain near the Grand Ronde River Valley, which, despite its beauty, posed its own set of dangers. Slowly, they ascended into the dense evergreen forests of the Blue Mountains. The sight of the Columbia River shimmering in the distance offered a glimpse of hope. This mighty river, carving its way through the golden mesas of the Cascade Range, signaled that the long journey was nearing its conclusion. Crossing the Blue Mountains, however, was no easy feat. The forests were thick, and the emigrants had to clear the path themselves. Jesse A. Applegate later recalled the laborious process. The timber had to be cut and removed to make way for the wagons. The trees were cut just near enough to the ground to allow the wagons to pass over the stumps, and the road through the forest was only cleared out wide enough for a wagon to pass along. Poor weather often compounded the challenge. In 1843, a snowstorm slowed progress and made conditions miserable. Jesse described wading through mud and snow, struggling against the cold and wet, which tested the endurance of every traveler. Despite the hardships, moments of respite and renewal were found along the way. Jesse's spirits lifted briefly when he encountered a stream lined with black hawthorn bushes. The small, sweet fruits, resembling buckshot, provided a welcome treat. "We ate large quantities of this fruit," he later wrote. However, this simple pleasure came with cautionary tales. One woman reportedly became ill after consuming too many of the ripe berries. Jesse, however, experienced no ill effects and found the fruit to be ripe and mellow. By late October, the Applegate wagon train reached Fort Walla Walla, a critical stop before the final leg of their journey to the Willamette Valley. The rugged Cascade Range loomed ahead, with towering peaks that rose steeply from the earth. The highest of these, Mount Hood, stood at nearly 11,250 feet, its snow-capped summit visible from miles away. But the mountains posed an insurmountable obstacle to the travelers. The route through the Columbia River Gorge was too narrow and treacherous for their wagons. Therefore, the Applegate party was forced to pause at Fort Walla Walla, where they spent approximately 2 weeks preparing for the final stretch. They spent their time chopping wood and constructing skiffs to transport their belongings and themselves across the river. Wagons, cattle, and horses had to be abandoned, adding to the sense of hardship that had defined their journey. By early November, a small fleet of makeshift boats set off down the Columbia River toward the Willamette Valley. Jesse Applegate, reflecting on this moment, recalled the sense of excitement he felt as they started their river journey. "I well remember our start down the river and how I enjoyed riding in the boat, the movement of which was like a grapevine swing," he later wrote, recalling the moment with a mix of childlike wonder and nostalgia. However, the Columbia River, known for its swift currents and unpredictable rapids, soon proved to be a serious challenge. After more than 5 months on the trail, the emigrants were about to face the most difficult segment of their journey. Despite being on water, the river presented its own set of obstacles. The journey downstream took several days, but it would ultimately extend another month, filled with peril and exhaustion. As the boats floated along the river, they approached the first set of rapids, an experience that would test everyone's courage and resolve. Jesse rode in one boat with his parents, his Uncle Jesse, Aunt Cynthia, and an Indian pilot, while his brothers Elisha and Warren, along with young cousin Edward Applegate and two other men, rode in another boat. As they neared a river bend, Jesse heard the sound of rushing water ahead. His boat began to pitch and roll violently as it hit the rapids. "I could see breakers ahead extending in broken lines across the river," Jesse later described, and the boat began to sweep along at a rapid rate. Meanwhile, Jesse watched helplessly as the other boat capsized. The sight of the men and boys struggling in the water was heart-wrenching. Jesse's father and uncle were ready to jump into the water to save their family, but their wives, Jesse's mother and aunt, urged them to stay focused on their own boat. The men, realizing the danger of the swift current, turned their attention back to the oars just in time to avoid smashing into a massive rock that jutted out of the river. "The foam and froth upon its apex was as white as milk," Jesse wrote, describing the perilous moment. Meanwhile, the other boat, carried by the whirlpool, was drawn beneath the surface. In the chaos that followed, Jesse's brother Elisha, along with two men in their 20s, managed to make it to shore. However, 70-year-old Alexander McClellan, who had been trying to help young Edward Applegate to safety, was not so lucky. Despite his advanced age, McClellan had heroically placed the boy on a pair of oars, hoping to swim him to shore. But McClellan's strength gave out, and both he and young Edward were pulled under. The selfless sacrifice of the elderly McClellan was noted by Jesse, who later wrote, "He could have saved himself by abandoning the boy, but this he would not do." Tragically, Jesse's brother Warren also drowned in the capsizing. Jesse, though only 8 years old at the time, would carry the memory of this heartbreaking loss with him for the rest of his life. Despite the trauma, the survivors continued their journey, navigating the remaining rapids without further incident. In late November 1843, they finally arrived at their destination, Fort Vancouver, established by the Hudson's Bay Company in 1825. The fort offered much-needed relief, with food, rest, and shelter after their harrowing journey. Yet the Applegates' arrival marked only the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. The challenges of settling in the Willamette Valley awaited them, constructing homes, cultivating land, and building a new future in an unfamiliar territory. The Applegates spent their first winter in log cabins at the old mission, near what is now the small town of Gervais, Oregon. The isolation and loss of loved ones weighed heavily on Jesse A. Applegate, who later wrote about the bittersweet nature of their arrival. "Oh, how we could have enjoyed our hospitable shelter if we could have looked around the family circle and beheld all the bright faces that had accompanied us on our toilsome journey almost to the end. Alas, they were not there." The emotional toll of the journey and the absence of those who had not made it would remain with him for years to come. In the years that followed, the Oregon Trail became the route of choice for thousands of immigrants seeking a better life in the West. In 1844, 1,475 people made the arduous journey to Oregon. By 1845, the number had risen to 2,500. The gold rush of 1849 prompted many travelers to shift their focus to California, but Oregon continued to attract settlers as well. Between 1841 and 1866, nearly 350,000 people journeyed along the famous trail. Remarkably, traces of their passage still remain. In some places, the deep ruts carved into the earth by the wagon wheels are still visible, a testament to the endurance and determination of those who risked everything to make the West their home. As we've seen, the Oregon Trail was far from the romanticized journey many imagine. The hardships endured by those brave pioneers, grueling physical challenges, endless days of travel, and the constant threat of disease paint a picture of survival, not adventure. But despite all the suffering, there were moments of triumph and hope that helped carry people across this perilous stretch of land. If you found this glimpse into the Oregon Trail fascinating, be sure to hit that subscribe button. There's much more to explore about the gritty, often brutal realities of the American Old West. Stay tuned for our next deep dive into history's untold stories.